2h10 da manhã. Tá ficando comum eu repetir isso, né? No começo das coisas. Cheguei em casa hoje. 6 e pouco. 6h30. E eu tinha um plano. Botar a desgraça da CPU que chegou. Zerar Dark Souls. E treinar. E dormir antes de meia-noite. Até agora, 2 da manhã, eu tava fazendo troubleshoot da desgraça do Windows 11, dessa placa, não sei do que é que tá ruim. Mas se eu usar a porra do DisplayPort, tá saindo sem som. E não dá pra botar o DisplayPort aqui. Eu tenho que botar o DisplayPort nesse aqui que tem que ter som. Aí tá na merda suprema, na desgraça. Eu instalei, desinstalei Drive, mexi em tudo e não vai de jeito nenhum essa porra. Então eu vou dormir, só que eu tenho que me empurrar no chão um pouco antes de dormir. Então hoje é dia 18, parece? Dia de braço. Então vou me empurrar no chão assim umas vezes e vou dormir. Então bora lá. Só bora.
Georgia, Moldova, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Serbia, Turkey, and Ukraine, and one potential candidate country in Kosovo. Montenegro is very much the frontrunner. It's opened 33 negotiation chapters and closed 7. Albania is next. After completing its screening in 2023, it began opening chapters in October 2024 and has already opened 28. Serbia is also well advanced, having opened 22 chapters and closed 2.
Fazer 8.
Progress has really stalled. As well as the EU postponed new negotiations in the third cluster until Serbia makes clear progress on rule of law reforms and normalising relations with Kosovo. Other candidate countries aren't yet to open any chapters. Moldova and Ukraine became candidate states in 2022, just a few months after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Só 8 de leve. O que antes era demais. Porque tem esses daqui, né? Esse aqui cansa. E acho que eu tá usando o mesmo grupo de músculos. Só que eu não posso botar pra amanhã porque os músculos vai estar descansando ainda amanhã. Então, tem que revezar assim, em vez de cansar o músculo todo só né, na subida, no chão aqui na flexão, eu tenho que fazer na barra também. Mas eu tenho que dar uma pausa agora por um tempo pra fazer. Vou esperar 2 minutos.
Now, enlargement requires unanimous approval from all 27 member states, and that's become increasingly hard. And it's become member countries increasingly use their veto power to block the progress of candidate
Outro
countries.
vídeo sobre a União Europeia na merda, sem conseguir aprovar as coisas do sistema dos caras emprestados para crescer em largamento.
Hungary's veto has also frozen Moldova's progress, as it's tied to Ukraine's membership. Elsewhere, similar blockages have occurred. Greece and Bulgaria delayed North Macedonia's membership for over a decade due to disputes over history and national identity. And Albania, which has also faced heat from Greece over the status of the Albanian Greek minority, became collateral damage because its accession process was coupled with North Macedonia's. Another issue are the apparent inconsistencies in how the EU treats individual applications. Critics often note that Bulgaria and Romania, which joined nearly 20 years ago, did so with weaker rule of law standards than some of today's frontrunners. The EU has also been uneven in handling territorial disputes. Moldova, for instance, isn't required to resolve Transnistria status before joining, and Cyprus entered in 2004 despite being divided. Meanwhile, candidates like Kosovo, Serbia and Bosnia have all seen their bids stall over similar issues, fueling frustration and opening the door for populist nationalist leaders to exploit the process. And these delays have undermined both public opinion and political commitment to accession in the candidate countries. So, conscious of these shortcomings, European leaders have recently suggested several reform ideas to make accession faster and fairer. One proposal is to separate bilateral disputes from technical progress, so political or historical disagreements don't block reforms on issues like rule of law, justice or corruption. This would let countries advance on merit, even if territorial or identity conflicts remain unresolved. Similarly, others have proposed decoupling Moldova's accession process from Ukraine's, allowing it to move forward on its own merits and avoid becoming collateral damage. And last month, following the re-election of Moldova's pro-EU government, dozens of MEPs called to immediately advance Moldova's accession negotiations. And there is a precedent for this. In 2023, the EU separated Albania's grid from North Macedonia's, allowing Albania to open 5 of 6 negotiation clusters in just 11 months. The vast progress in However, critics warn that splitting the pair could serve as key at a time when NATO membership remains uncertain. That might be seen as a political win for Orban and other leaders who want to use their veto power to obstruct the parliament. Another more general solution to the accession problem comes from French President Emmanuel Macron and former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who have suggested creating a two-speed Europe. Under this model, new members could gradually integrate, joining parts of the EU, such as the single market, customs union, or education and energy programs, all meaning full membership rights. The idea is to deliver tangible benefits early, keeping candidate countries motivated, while full membership remains the ultimate goal. Last week, addressing the European Parliament, the Luxembourg Prime Minister revived the idea of a two-speed Europe, arguing that the bloc is also facing a handful of other challenges, such as trade wars with China and the US,
Caralho, tá pior que a vez passada.
the EU's decision-making process. Critics, however, warn that this could create a two-tier Europe, where some members are seen as second class. A third idea, proposed by a German-Slovenian non-paper, and more recently by the European Council President,
Não consegui fazer direito. Eu consegui fazer o 6 no começo. Só morrer mais tarde, que nem outra vez. Mas nem 6 eu fiz. Fiz 3, depois fiz 1, depois fiz 1, depois fiz 1. Eu não sei que parte que é o músculo que tá limitando. Parece não ser meu tríceps no momento. Será que é meu braquialis? Não, porque nesse outro eu vou falhar também.
Meaning that implementing QMB at certain stages can be done without treaty reform. However, many countries who regularly use vetoes to their benefit are likely less keen on this idea. If switching to QMB doesn't gain enough support, then a fourth and more forceful idea could be for the EU to invoke Article 7 and actually suspend Hungary's voting rights at the European Council. Regardless, the politics of EU enlargement are constantly changing and updating as more and more outlets begin to report on it. For instance, take the story of Western Balkans leaders gathering last week in Albania to affirm their commitment to joining the EU. Right now, there are 38 sources reporting on it, with
It's an insurrection, rebellion, anarchy in the streets. Were you at Pilates when the country descended into lawlessness? Hate it when that happens. Or doesn't happen. Things the president says are not real.
Portland is burning to the ground. It's insurrectionists all over the place.
Like that. That never happened. But the Trump administration says the president has the absolute right to declare an emergency based on stuff he just made up, and no court can stop him. And he's reportedly considering invoking the Insurrection Act to allow to put soldiers on American streets to act as policemen.
Well, I knew it was necessary. Someone has to be necessary. But we have an insurrection act for a reason. If I had to enact it, I knew that if people were being killed and courts were holding us up, or governors and mayors were holding us up, I want to make sure that people aren't killed.
Yeah, we do have an Insurrection Act for a reason, and that reason is not because the
8:40.
president makes up stories about roving bands of black-clad Antifa members burning down cities.
Ice is not nice.
Without first talking about the Posse Comitatus Act. In the United States, the military does not engage in civilian law enforcement. Back in ye olde England, a local lawman would call up a crew of able-bodied men to enforce the law and hunt down criminals. On this side of the Atlantic, the sheriff's posse was a regular fixture of the American West. But after the Civil War, southern states didn't want the federal government using the military to enforce desegregation. And so Congress passed the Posse Comitatus Act in 1878 to make sure that the former Confederacy could implement Jim Crow laws, ensuring that formerly enslaved black Americans could never vote or exercise political power. The act is just one sentence. It says, whoever, except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress, willfully uses any part of the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, or the Space Force as a posse comitatus, or otherwise to execute the laws, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 2 years or both. And And despite its sordid origins, the Posse Comitatus Act has become a pillar of American civil-military relations. In this country, the military does not enforce the law. We do not have soldiers in the street. We have civilian law enforcement, both federal and state. And the military has its own justice system, separate and distinct from civil courts. But Donald Trump has never understood this. Way back in 2013, he tweeted, "We need our troops on the streets of Chicago, not in Syria." That would have been entirely illegal, but in 2013, Trump was just a civilian, so it didn't matter if the star of The Apprentice didn't understand the Posse Comitatus Act. Today, it matters. But Trump's understanding of civil-military relations has not evolved.
I told Pete, we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, military. As president, I will never hesitate to defend our people from threats, from the horrible plague that's taking place.
No, we cannot use American cities as training grounds for our military. Are you crazy? This isn't the Hunger Games. We have millions of civilian law enforcement officers whose actual job is to wield the police power to ensure that people follow the law. And if you think that crime rates are a good metric for how good a job cops are doing, well, crime rates are down everywhere, particularly in cities. But that's just in the real world. Over at the White House,
I'm announcing a historic action to rescue our nation's capital from crime, bloodshed, bedlam, and squalor, and worse.
Perfeito. 23
because of
também.
DC's unique status
Tô
as a
sentindo no
federally
bíceps.
controlled city that is part of no state, the president was able to call up the DC National
Eu
Guard
dói a
and
mão,
even
velho.
send in guard troops from other states. There wasn't a tremendous amount for them to do in a city of just 700,000 people, though, but that didn't stop Trump from taking credit for ending crime in the nation's capital.
The capital of America was a bloodthirsty, horrible, dangerous place, one of the worst. And now it's a crime-free
Porra,
city.
Rui tá foda.
Again, he did not end crime in DC, but that did not stop
É um pouco pesado. O do filme era pesado, às vezes morria. Esse aqui é um pouco pesado.
Crazy out there, and so now is probably a good time
E eu
to
morro
wipe
por
all
algum-
your personal and private information off the
Alguma
internet.
limitação que eu não sei qual é o que tá me limitando nesse movimento.
Media accounts and tons of
Aí bora continuar tentando que vai, né?
anybody online, but you can fight back and take control of your private information by signing up for today's sponsor, Incogni. Incogni wipes your personal data from the internet by searching the internet, reaching out to Databrook, where we will see you in court. So much of what Trump has done in the past 9 months has rested on emergency powers delegated by Congress. We got constantly shifting tariffs because of the emergency trade deficit. We shipped a bunch of Venezuelan men, most of whom had never been arrested, to seek out prison in El Salvador because Trump said we were being invaded by the Venezuelan government and invoked the Alien Enemies Act. Trump declares an energy emergency to override all environmental regulations. It's clear that Congress believed two things when it drafted those emergency power statutes. First, legislators assumed that the president would act in good faith and not just pull the alarm bell and shout emergency every time he wanted to do stuff that would otherwise be illegal. Second, they took as a given that future Congresses would jealously guard their own power and revoke that emergency authority if the president misused it. Obviously, they bet wrong there too. And maybe those legislators believed a third thing, which is that courts would put a stop to any blatant abuse of emergency authority. Sadly, none of that turned out to be true. Instead, the president is treating endemic issues like acute ones, and he says that his own subjective or even blatantly false characterization of an emergency is the final word and cannot be reviewed by any court. So if he says Portland's on fire and needs the military to keep order, then it's on fire and no court can say, what? No, it's not, and block him from sending in troops. One of these emergency delegations of authority by Congress is 10 U.S.C. Section 12406, which empowers the president to take control of state militias in case of invasion, rebellion, or when he is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. That was the authority Trump relied on to federalize California's National Guard. DHS surged ICE agents into the greater LA area, and they encountered random pockets of sporadic violence, which were immediately quelled by the LAPD and the LA Sheriff's Department. Trump seized on that moment of violence as justification to send in the National Guard and Marines. The Justice Department argued that the president's declaration that he's unable to execute the laws is unreviewable by any court. Here, have a video. Have two. The Ninth Circuit said that courts do have the right to review the president's determination under 12406, but that it wasn't totally crazy to say that the rioting in LA hindered the president's ability to execute the laws, and so the deployment of the National Guard was legal. Notably, even guardsmen
Não consigo mexer na desgraça da RGB, não sei se tá conectado, mando pulsar, não acontece nada, nosso controlador de fã, a vida é foda no computador, hein? Não consigo fazer nada hoje em dia, nem me levantar no chão. No chão tá indo até, agora na barra não tá indo não.
systematically used arms soldiers whose identity was often obscured by protective armor and military vehicles to set up protective perimeters and traffic blockades, engage in crowd control, and otherwise demonstrate a military presence in and around Los Angeles. In short, defendants violated the Posse Comitatus Act. He based that in part on this training slide. See how it's got a list of prohibited law enforcement activities, but 4 of them are highlighted in red? The judge found that the troops were orally instructed that the 4 functions listed in red, security patrols, traffic control, crowd control, and riot control,
15.
were subject to a so-called constitutional exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. Essentially, the Defense Department took the position that when federal agents or facilities were under attack, troops are allowed to engage in these law enforcement functions, which may make sense, except that the government took the position that wherever federal personnel go, National Guard troops can accompany them and establish perimeter control, engage in crowd control, and otherwise perform any functions necessary to ensure the execution of federal functions and the safety of federal personnel. And in fact, they argued that even when there is no threat to the safety or security of federal personnel or property, the mere possibility that federal law enforcement agents might not be able to do their job could justify deployment of National Guard troops as a preventative measure, which means that the exception functionally swallows the rule, and they can violate the Posse Comitatus Act at will. The Ninth Circuit stayed that ruling by Judge Breyer and has not yet addressed it as of this recording, so as of today, Guard troops can and are doing things which a court has found violate the Posse Comitatus Act. But remember up top when Trump said he might invoke the Insurrection Act if courts didn't let him do what he wants? That is what he means. Okay, but let's come back to that in a sec, because first we need to talk about Portland and Chicago, the next 2 cities where Trump wants to send in troops. On the campaign trail, Trump promised to solve crime in a matter of weeks through the judicious application of police brutality.
You know, if you had one day, like one real rough, nasty day. Now, if you had one really violent day, one rough hour, and I mean real rough, the word will get out, and it will end immediately.
But he's been in the White House for 9 months and he's still banging that drum.
We've been living through a horrific cycle of political violence in this country. Night after night, Antifa wreaks havoc on our streets of our cities.
Again, there is no Antifa crime wave. That is totally made up. There is absolutely no evidence that the man who killed Democratic lawmaker Melissa Workman and her husband Mark was affiliated with anti-fascist movements. And there's no evidence that Portland, Oregon is under siege by Antifa. It looks like what happened is that Fox News aired this video on the evening of September 4th.
I watched today, I didn't know that was continuing to go on, but Portland is unbelievable what's going on. Destruction of the city. You know, that was not on my list, Portland, but when I watched television last night, what they've done to that place is it's like living in hell.
That footage is from protests outside the local ICE detention center in 2020. Nothing like that has taken place in years, but President Couch Potato saw it and decided that the city was on fire now. On September 27th, Trump ordered Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth to
18.
flood Portland with troops, and the next day, Hegseth issued a memo to Oregon's Governor Tina Kotek purporting to federal activation of troops pursuant to Section 12406. The state filed suit to block the president seizing control of its militia, noting that the Portland police have consistently made themselves available to federal agents stationed at the ICE facility in their town, and they received 0 requests for assistance since June, when there were a few minor acts of vandalism by protesters. The lawless mayhem and attacks on ICE agents Trump talks about never happened. Although Kristi Noem has been creating content with conservative podcaster Benny Johnson, trying to whip up terror about guys in inflatable frog and chicken costumes. And the chicken outfit I just seen him now.
Falta força no pai, velho, que falta força.
The federal court in Oregon held a hearing and issued a temporary restraining order barring the federalization of the state's guard. As she pointed out, Section 12406 requires a presidential determination that there's rebellion, or at a minimum that he can't carry out the laws. And that's just not the reality on the ground, where the protests in Portland have generally involved fewer than 50 people and have been wholly peaceful. In the entire month before Trump called the war,
Ixi, no final, quase fiz a sexta.
agents
Acho que sempre progresso leve, né?
setting up a makeshift guillotine to intimidate
Alguma coisa tá sendo um limitador, velho. Não comi direito, nem dormi direito ontem, nem hoje. Eu acho que nem até ontem. Vai ser isso, né?
And then, when the Trump administration tried to get around that order by deploying National Guard troops from other states like Texas, Judge Immergut held an emergency hearing on Sunday night and issued a second TRO to block the deployment of any state's militia inside Oregon. The judge was big mad, and when a judge reminds you that you are an officer of the court repeatedly, well, she's not asking because she thinks your arguments are consistent with the ethical practice of law. But the Ninth Circuit was apparently not convinced. The appeals court has not issued a ruling as of this reporting, but we did watch the oral argument on October 9th, and it seemed like the panel was leaning pretty heavily in favor of letting the president deploy the guard.
That's a little bit of the irony here is that because the president acted in June in LA, I mean, I don't know that we have the, I don't know, but it seems like we don't have the same level of violence going on in LA right now. But the president acted when there was violence, and you're saying, well, if you don't hit it within a narrow window, you lose your right. That just seems unnaturally constrained.
Well, what we have is a finding from the district court that the federal law enforcement officers, unaided by military forces, were capable of not only quelling the violence in June, but also preventing it through September. These are
I'd like to ask you about some specific facts that I don't think you disputed. So the facility was forced to close. It was inoperable for almost a month, from June 13th to July 7th. And the declarations from the director of the Federal Protective Services and the field operations director from DHS state that the facility only reopened because of a surge of 115 Federal Protective Services officers to Portland, right? So those are facts that occurred, but that the district judge didn't consider because she apparently viewed them as out of time, that this had occurred. Are those not facts that are relevant to for the president to determine the threat?
If we said forces are allowed, and then what, we come back to
Tem
the next day and
false
say,
people
oh,
like
we're
this,
under control, now they're not allowed, then it goes back up, oh, they're allowed. I mean, it just seems like such a tortured reading of the statute. I mean, I'm not even sure President Lincoln would have been able to bring the forces when he did, because he'd have to wait, you know, if he didn't do it right after, immediately after Fort Sumter, your argument would be, oh, things are okay right now.
So, it seems pretty likely that soldiers will soon be patrolling the streets
Você tem um RGB,
keeping
velho.
America safe from the dangerous scourge of people dressed as
Muito
uniforms
com
and
RGB.
dinosaurs. Meanwhile, the president has set his sights on Chicago as the next city to get troops in the streets. Trump has long fantasized about militarizing law enforcement in the Windy City. In 2022, he said that the president would have no choice but to send the National Guard to Chicago to fight crime. Now, granted, crime is down in Chicago by a lot, and even if it weren't, it would still violate the Posse Comitatus Act to send in the National Guard to stop it.
And this cannot go on anymore. Every other approach has been considered and tried, and they've tried the weak approach. They've been trying it for years, and really trying it over the last couple of years, and it's not working. It's time to go a different direction. And only one option remains. The next president needs to send the National Guard to the most dangerous neighborhoods in Chicago until safety can be successfully restored, which can happen very, very quickly.
And remember, soldiers are not policemen. They're not trained to enforce the law or even to obey it. Civilian law enforcement officers are supposed to understand what constitutes grounds for a search, rules of engagement with the public, like when you can engage in a high-speed chase of a suspect. That's not what the National Guard does, and it's frankly not what ICE does either. And it's important to note that the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration about Chicago doesn't really have anything to do with immigration enforcement. Remember, the reason they gave for deploying troops to LA was that ICE agents weren't able to conduct raids fast enough because of the protesters, and the reason they needed to go into Portland because of the non-existent attacks on the ICE facility. What's the emergency here in Chicago? Why is Customs and Border Patrol riding around on the Chicago River loaded for bear? Here, the pretext involves protests outside an ICE facility in Broadview, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. Those protests have been minor, but that hasn't stopped federal officials from unleashing indiscriminate volleys of pepper balls, rubber bullets, and tear gas. Here they are shooting a priest in the head with a pepper ball as he prays in front of the facility. On October 4th, Exet sent a memo to Illinois demanding to federalize 300 of the state's National Guard. 2 days later, the state sued, seeking a temporary restraining order to block deployment of soldiers in the state, alleging that it would violate the terms of Section 12406, the 10th Amendment, and the Posse Comitatus Act. President Trump claims that Governor Pritzker and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson have refused to protect ICE agents in Illinois from Antifa mobs. He even demanded that they be arrested. In reality, local and state police have actively worked to interpose themselves between protesters and federal agents, and claims that the federal government is unable to execute the laws are pretty substantially undercut by DHS's constant press releases bragging about the wild success of its Chicagoland operation, which they've done big blitzes saying stuff like, Antifa and their friends haven't stopped us, they're not even slowing us down. ICE certainly doesn't seem to be intimidated. On September 29th, DHS used Black Hawk helicopters to raid an entire apartment building. As the state notes, while it is not clear whether any part of that conduct was within any lawful federal authority, defendants were not impeded in executing this large-scale planned operation. Illinois argues that the Trump administration can't claim it needs to call up troops to execute the laws while simultaneously patting itself on the back for what a good job it's doing executing those laws. On October 10th, Judge April Perry issued a temporary restraining order barring federalization of Illinois National Guard. She said that the government had failed to demonstrate that it was unable to execute the laws as required under Section 12406. Here, defense have made no attempt to rely
Tô
on
cansado em nada, velho. Acho que é um antebraço. O braço tá duro, velho, morrendo.
nor do defendants argue
Não dá cansado, mas tá
to
duro, velho.
suggest that the president is incapable with the regular
É não,
forces of
tava
executing
só
the laws.
flexionando.
Therefore, the statutory predicate
Tem
contained
nada aí
in
afetado, é só o antebraço mesmo.
has not been met on that basis alone. That order was partially stayed by the Seventh Circuit, which allowed the guard troops to be federalized but not deployed and sent out into the streets. We will see what happens there. I think Spencer's got a video on the hopper on that one. But what if courts tell Trump no? What if this move to use the military to enforce immigration laws by protecting ICE agents does get blocked by the judges? Well, then we're going to be in uncharted territory. The most important thing to know about the Insurrection Act is that it is an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. If the president invokes the Insurrection Act, he can send troops into the cities to enforce the law. So you could potentially have the military conducting immigration raids in major U.S. cities. Lots of media commentators refer to that as
Sei.
but I do not get paid to spout euphemism, so I'm going to
Próxima vez, talvez eu consiga. Parece que é o antebraço aqui que tá morrendo.
and it's one that may be coming soon.
Não, limitado dessa vez.
Trump posted an attorney general's
Quando eu te treinar, um dia eu vou conseguir treinar peito, finalmente, mas por enquanto tá difícil a coisa. No chão deve ser esse aqui ainda, tá aparecendo já. E no de se levantar parece que é o antebraço.
2020 after George Floyd was murdered by police in Minneapolis. But let's go back to the beginning.
Mas foi isso aí. Valeu.
After the war, the brand new
Deixa eu terminar um pouco de troubleshoot aqui dessa desgraça.
Eden posted excise
Enquanto eu termino de assistir aqui também
distilled spirits.